Well, we're glad to be with everybody. I know we've talked about this over the last month in preparation, and we've got our team assembled here from Warden Smith and the Ferguson Group. What we're going to do briefly is Roger Gwynn, who's the CEO of the Ferguson Group, is going to touch briefly on where we are in Washington right now, because that affects the entire atmosphere of anything and everything happening. And after Roger does that, then we were going to go to talk about the beach renourishment issues and the coastal issues that may tie in there to the Wilmington Harbor project. So Drew and Bill from Brooks and Pierce, you're welcome to comment at that point. Brad Schwittenberg, who was listening into Eric Olson the last hour, and who also is formerly work as a senior policy analysis and in some other positions for the Army Corps of Engineers regionally and nationally, is going to be speaking on our behalf regarding that as well. And then briefly after that, Stephanie Missert will discuss one of the earmark projects we're considering on the wastewater treatment plant. Christopher Kearney will have a brief update on the offshore wind situation. And then I'll circle back around and we'll mention about what's coming up in Washington at the end of next month when we, Lord willing, hope we can all be there and take care of some business on Capitol Hill. So with that, Roger, if you'll go ahead and give us an update of where we are in Washington, and then from that, Brad, I'll let Roger go right in with you on where we are on the coastal projects right now, and we'll welcome Drew and Bill Carey's comment at that point as well. Okay, Roger.
Yep. Thank you, Mike. And you can just go to the slide that references the, keep going, I'll pass this. And a little bit more, and Washington, D.C. update. Yes, the next slide, please. That'd be great. So just in terms of where we are right now, FY24 appropriations process, while it's stalled, there is an end in sight. Basically, we're right now, government's operating under a continuing resolution. And basically what that means is just keeping the government operating at the prior fiscal year levels and through this on an interim period until the FY25 appropriations process concludes. And the government's operating under a continuing resolution that's adopted what's called a laddered approach to funding. And basically that's portion of the government is under a continuing resolution that operates through March 1st, and then the balance is through March 8th. There are agencies under 4 bills that will expire on March 1st, and then the balance of the 12 appropriations bills expire on March 8th. And most importantly, the Bald Head Island is the Commerce, Justice, State Appropriations Bill, and that's the bill that includes funding the $4.5 million secured by Representative Rouser for the Bald Head Island Coastal Storm Damage Reduction Project, and that continues to be in good position for favorable consideration and inclusion in the final spending package. There's a little bit of a challenge with the overall spending levels. They're the final numbers are a bit below what was provided on the Senate side for this bill, but nonetheless, I remain optimistic that that bill will be approved by the March 8th deadline for the current continuing resolution that covers that bill, and that ultimately it will include the allocation of funding that Representative Rouser has requested on behalf of Bald Head Island. Assuming that the Bald Head Island request is approved, we'd expect those funds to be available within about 6 months of enactment. So, fairly shortly in the middle part of this calendar year. In terms of, if you could go to the next slide, in terms of looking ahead, FY25, the fiscal year 25 appropriations process is certainly going to be front and center immediately after the work is concluded on FY24. The budget request itself, President's budget request itself is expected to be, the President's expecting to submit it to the Congress on March 11th. We are already seeing some offices notice constituents that they are interested in receiving requests for FY25. And again, we'll be working with your folks to identify opportunities to pursue in the FY25 appropriations process going forward. But we expect us to get into full swing, shortly after the budget request comes up to the Hill. Also, the other things that are getting a lot of attention and will get a lot of attention for the balance of calendar year 24 are the tax reform package and including disaster assistance reform. Farm bill is still on, is going to get a lot of attention going forward. Water Resource Development Act, we expect the Water Resource Development Act. This is the bill that authorizes the Corps of Engineers programs on a biannual basis. And so this will, we expect this to be an act dealt with in calendar year 2024 and either in all likelihood right before the end of the calendar year in the lame duck session, but nonetheless there'll be significant House and Senate action on the Water Resource Development Act. And certainly your Representative Rouser will be right in the middle of that. He's the chair of the subcommittee that has responsibility for putting that bill together. Important to Bald Head Island, certainly. Beyond that, you've seen a lot in the news on what's going on now and discussions about trying to put together a package for dealing with the border and foreign military aid. That'll continue to get, as you are seeing today, continue to get attention going forward. There's still work to be done on that. So those are the sort of top line activities that'll be a priority for the current calendar year and for the balance of the session. And let me turn over to Brad Schwichtenberg to talk about some of the core issues that we've been dealing with here. Brad?
Great. Good morning. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the beach renourishment and contributed funds agreement and the feasibility study. Next slide. Okay, so we consider this as far as one of the Army Corps' contributions to the town, a short-term opportunity here. And the idea here is to put in place a multi-year contributed funds agreement wherein the town could contribute money above federal appropriations for maintenance dredging that occurs in the channel. And the way this would work is the agreement would be executed between the town and the Army Corps, and it would allow the additional sand to be dredged and added onto the Bald Head Island shorelines. It's a voluntary contribution of funds, of local funds. There's no creditor repayment that's going to be allowed by the federal government. So it is a contribution. It goes in the operation and maintenance account of the Army Corps. And it's above and beyond federal appropriations. Next slide. It requires execution of a contributed funds agreement. It can be a single-year agreement. We're seeking a multi-year agreement. Because it's a multi-year agreement, there's not a standard agreement in place that we can use. However, there are agreements that have successfully been done that we're going to use as a starting point. Earl Stockdale, who also works for the Ferguson Group, was former top attorney at the Army Corps and deputy attorney for the Army, is working on this. He's already talked with the top lawyer in Wilmington District. They've mapped out 4 different potential paths. So they're in the process of figuring out the best vehicle to make this happen. When this agreement gets executed, then it allows the city to contribute funds in any given year. It doesn't require, it allows. And another thing in the agreement we'll be seeking is flexibility on where to locate the sand. As Eric Olson mentioned, the Corps, when it does its maintenance dredging, disposes in the least cost, environmentally acceptable place. And if we want sand placed in other areas on the island, then the least cost, environmentally acceptable, we can certainly pay the extra to have the sand placed there. Next. All right, so there's a whole processing piece of this once the draft package is assembled. Initially what happens is the draft, and this is a general outline. Initially what happens is the draft package is created between the Wilmington District and the village. And once it's in in the form that both the village and the Wilmington district are satisfied with. It does have to go through a couple levels of review within the administration. It goes up to the division office first in Atlanta. We'll expect some minor comments and tweaks. Yeah, you all get to, weigh in and approve everything as this process goes, and change language, whatever needs to be done, so that everybody's happy. After it passes the division level, it goes to the national level at headquarters usage, where again, it's reviewed. Any modifications, tweaks are made. And then the headquarters owns the package at this point, and it sends it up to Army, gets cleared through the administration, and a congressional notification piece occurs. And what this is the administration. Technically, it's a notification process, but it's more of a general person's agreement that the Corps will submit these packages, and the Congress gets eyes on the package and basically attain a no objection, if you will, from the committees in the Congress. So it's not a formal written, it's approved. It's we've notified you. What do you think? They spend some time looking at it. We don't have any objections. And then what happens, Army Corps headquarters gets that concurrence, if you will, and sends a letter down to Wilmington and says, you have the authority to execute the agreement. You have so many days to execute the agreement. It is to be executed in this final language, and at which point both parties sign and we're off and running. The congressional notification process and the administration clearance process can take a number of months. So I don't want you to think that once it goes to headquarters in 2 weeks, we're going to get that letter back saying you're good to go. It can take several months, up to 6 months. And part of that is headquarters processing time. Part of that is Army and OMB processing time. And part of that is simply time for the Hill to, say that they're acceptable to the package. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to kind of stop here and ask if there are any questions on that before we go into the feasibility study. And Earl Stockdale's our expert on this, but I can answer 30,000-foot questions.
Just want Brad, just to point out that this MOA that we're talking about, the fact that we're going through the exercise of negotiating it and the 6-month window, the first chance we'd actually have to actually use it is not until the next core dredging of the channel, which is years from now. So it's opportune we're doing it now.
Excellent point. Any other comments or thoughts? Okay. Wow, that's great. Okay. Well, stay tuned. There'll be more, back and forth on that, and you all will be very closely involved as this process occurs. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about, and this is, Eric Olson, I think, very eloquently described the ongoing maintenance dredging that the Corps does, the Wilmington Harbor Channel, and the agreement on the 2 islands sharing the sand, and then 2-to-1 time frames where twice it goes to Bald Head Island and once it goes to Oak Island, and that's all in place. And what this is a formal, this is a longer term solution / study. And the idea of this Army Corps feasibility study would be to have the Army Corps be the lead federal agency to study your shoreline and to look at it from a federal perspective of, is there a 50-year beach nourishment project that is warranted? So let me explain what this is. The Corps has been doing these studies for quite a long time. They've been cost shared 50-50 since I think 1986. And the idea is it's a 3-year, $3 million study You all would pay $1.5 million in either cash or in-kind services or both. In-kind services could be stuff that Mr. Olson does, stuff that you hire economists or geologists or biologists to do, etc. Anyway, it's a $3 million 3-year study. That cost and time can go up if it's very complex, but that's generally what the Corps tries to shoot at. And the purpose of the study is to look at what kind of damages would occur to private and public infrastructure by waves and increased water levels due to storms and just regular erosion that occurs year in, year out. And if those damages can be reduced by a project where the benefits outweigh the costs, the Corps then recommends a study for Congress to write into law, an actual project. So what we need, though, to start the study, we would need, if the town and others are in agreement that the study would be something you would like to seek, it needs a new start study authorization from Congress, and we'll talk about that. And it needs money to start the study. Next slide. Okay, is that the next slide? Let me just double check. Hang on. Okay. So benefits, that's the next slide. Great. Okay, so the study is a benefit to you all in that the Corps, as the lead federal agency, will be working with other federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries, etc., as an equal partner. So you do your own study. I will just say this carefully: the state and federal agencies are certainly your partners, but they have a parity role when they're working with the Corps. I'll put it that way. So the Corps will be the honest broker, if you will, at the federal level to see if there's federal interest in this project. Another benefit to the study is it will develop scientific and engineering information that could help you. I know you have a lot of information already, but the purpose of the study will be for the Corps to work towards a recommended plan, such as an ongoing beach nourishment program. And as part of getting to that recommended plan, the Corps will fully develop the environmental work. They'll fully develop the engineering work and the economic work, which is very important for you all. And how that directly relates to you, even if the study ultimately doesn't result in a recommended plan, is they will do a detailed assessment of the potential borrow sites. They'll identify a borrow site that is least cost environmentally acceptable, which includes coordination with Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries, as Eric mentioned. There's been a lot of back and forth over the years on, on the two major shoals, Jaybird and Frying Pan shoals. So they'll look at both of those plus other options. And so you'll have the Corps working with the state and federal resource agencies on those issues on your behalf. Next slide. There are, of course, challenges as far as getting a new start feasibility study, and that is the first challenge is getting the authorization or the law or the congressional support, if you will, to start the study. Now, there has been a previous study authority issued, and our first task, if you all are interested in doing this, would be to look back at that old study language and see if it's still applicable, work with the Corps and see if that is still applicable, because then if that's true, you've already got that step secured. And then the second part would be to get the beginning part of the funding stream. The Corps would normally do a 3-year funding stream. The first part of the funding stream would be something like $150,000, which you would match to get the study kicked off, the scope of work done, who's doing what, all that good stuff, and sign a feasibility cost sharing agreement. So getting the language to start the study and the funding to start the study is is certainly hurdles we need to overcome. We'll help you with that. And then as we go through the study, ensuring that the shoreline would be available to the public is important, because the federal government doesn't want to invest in shoreline where only private citizens can access for recreational purposes. So, and you all already have, we've already talked cursory manner, and you already have a lot of good thoughts on that. And then lastly, as the study nears completion, the benefit to cost ratio. So there's two benefit to cost ratios we need to concern ourselves with in a study. The first one is it above 1? If the benefit cost ratio is above 1, as we get the recommended plan and we do all the economics and everything else, then the study can go to Congress, it can be written into law, and you have an authorized project. And for budgeting purposes in the president's budget, if it's greater than 2 to 1, then it's competitive in the president's budget. Now, it doesn't mean if it's between 1 and 2 that it's not going to be funded. We have projects in California and other parts of the country where the BC ratio was like 1.05, and the projects are getting money in special appropriations, et cetera. So the goal is to get above 1.0. And then half the benefits of the project can be recreation benefits associated with folks recreating on the beach. The other half would be a traditional coastal storm damage reduction, which are damages to private and public infrastructure that can be prevented. Next slide. So I'll just stop there and ask if there are any questions at this point on the 30,000-foot level on the feasibility study.
Brad, this is Scott Gardner. So is this a new thing, this coastal resources damage reduction? Or has this been ongoing and it's just new to us?
It's not new across the country. For instance, Florida has 140 miles of these projects already authorized and constructing.
Okay.
And I want to also say what's unique about this is, like when the Corps does a river project and they improve levees on a river, it's a construction project that is, one and done. But what's unique about the coastal projects is if you get an authorized project and it gets funded and constructed, it's a 50-year construction project. It's not a do it one time. So you get the initial nourishment, and then you get up to so many nourishments over a 50-year period.
Very good, thank you. Could you offer one or two of those grants relatively similar to what we're dealing with here that we could use as a resource and review and study and kind of get a better sense for how they work?
You mean examples?
Yes. You don't have to answer that right now, but think about it. It would be helpful, I think, for us to get our hands on where this has been done.
So Brad, I can add, New Hanover County, Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, and Curry Beach were part of, I understand, was one of the first 50-year Corps projects. And at
that's
one
correct.
point,
That is
yeah,
correct.
Mike can recall, he had a lot of work involved in that, where it ended and they got their 50-year, and Mike helped secure the extensions to it. So
Right.
that's an example. But going back to the original authorization for a feasibility study for a project in Brunswick County that Brad referenced, it goes back to I think it was in the late 50s, early 60s. And at the time, it only included Yopon Beach, Caswell, Yopon, formerly what's Oak Island, Yopon, Long Beach, Ocean Isle, Holden, Ocean Isle, and Sunset. But Bald Head wasn't included because nothing really existed on Bald Head.
Right.
So that's why I'd said to them, like, maybe this is an opportunity. But having said, and Eric may weigh in on a few of his concerns about going in this direction. I'm not saying there are enough that we would maybe deviate from it, but you know, that we don't want this in any way to remove the good thing we have with the sand management plan, which is free sand. That if in theory, I'm just talking out loud, if we did this feasibility study and we could get a 50-year project where that 50-year core project was done in lieu of the village doing what it's doing today, privately funding. I mean, that would be,
That's good.
that would be the ideal scenario, but can that be achieved is probably the big question.
So I can help you with that. The Army Corps study would look at what they call existing conditions. In other words, what's the current practice, and the current practice being to obtain that material from the maintenance dredging and put it on the shoreline. And the other thing that the study will do is it'll not only look at sand nourishment, but it'll look at other options. I know Eric mentioned geotechnical, the groins that you all have that have to be replaced every so often. So the study should be looking at that at the existing location and other locations. As Eric mentioned, for example, along with any other options. And so it's supposed to look at all viable options, including options that, you know, will likely not be implemented. But it wants to look at a suite of options. And then what it does is it screens out the obvious ones that can't be implemented because of state law or extreme local concerns or whatever. And it comes down with what they call a focused array of alternatives, 3 or 4 maybe, including beach nourishment, and it'll go from there to a recommended plan, which is really what you want to, no matter what happens with the study, you want to get to the recommended plan stage for the full economics, the full environmental, and the full engineering, so that you have all that information available to you from henceforth. You can use that environmental coordination, you can use that engineering and that economic analysis for further efforts. If the study, heaven forbid, doesn't come up with a BC ratio greater than 1, you still have all that information that you can use for your own efforts or for other efforts. And I'll stop.
Brad, with that, I know we've only got about 15 minutes or so left. Thank you. And as you all can see, this can have very exciting possibilities. It also can take very close attention to make sure that the decisions that are made regarding these types of studies or these opportunities are well considered, because the benefits can be tremendous depending on what the desire of the village council is. We've got a few minutes left, and I know we need to touch on a couple of other topics. I do want to mention that Drew and Bill, I know in terms of Wilmington Harbor project, we can come back to that if we have time, or if y'all would like some comments. I just want to make sure right now we can mention 2 other different projects that we need to at least have mentioned in this meeting. And one is the wastewater treatment plant that we visited and that we've talked about. Stephanie Missert, are you on the line?
I'm here.
Okay, can you go ahead and comment about the wastewater treatment plant as a potential earmark consideration that we have had some discussions with the town staff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we understand that the wastewater treatment plant is a priority to the village, and we've been tasked with identifying funding opportunities to support construction specifically of the wastewater treatment plant expansion project. And so here we have listed several different funding options that are separated into 2 categories. The first being FY 2025 appropriations or federal earmarks, as Roger mentioned earlier, and then competitive grants and loans. And here we'll start with the appropriations, because this is probably your best option for securing grant funding for the project, not just financing. And the first one we have listed here is the one that we would consider the most viable, which is the State and Tribal Assistance Grants program, which we call STAG. You're probably familiar with this because the village submitted an earmark request last year for this project under the STAG account. And I think the primary reason that the appropriation wasn't successful last year is because the coastal storm damage reduction, $4.5 million appropriation was the one that proceeded forward because it was your priority last year. So if you chose this project to be your priority earmark request this year, this is probably the account that we'd suggest that you compete under. The primary reason for that is because there's a lot of awards through this program. And it's quite flexible too in the way that you can request funding. So even though there's a minimum 20% federal match, you can actually request quite a bit more or less than that. It's not really a set, 20-80 split. And in the case of your project, which is now estimated to be about $30 to $33 million, you couldn't actually request the full 80% federal match because it would be significantly higher than even the biggest appropriation under that account in the past couple of years. So last year in FY23, the largest appropriation in that account was $19.1 million, which is quite a bit more than the average award, which is $1.8 million. So if you were to request the full 80%, that'd be $24.6 million, I think. So way more than you could actually realistically get. But you could request, let's say, a 20% federal match or cost share, which would be about 6.6 million or something like that. So you could still get some grant funding and lower the overall, financing that you would need to secure for the project. But you just wouldn't get a full grant to cover the project, which I'm sure you understand is extremely difficult to do. Even if you're like a highly distressed community, you're hard pressed to get grant funding to cover a whole project. But you could get several $1 million and it could help lower the total financing cost of the project. So that'd be kind of our primary suggestion to you. And then the second opportunity under appropriations, it's still a good match for your project. It's probably not the ideal one, and I'll explain why, but we wanted to bring this Section 5113 Environmental Infrastructure Authority up to you because you probably haven't heard of this. It's kind of like a hidden gem. It's what we kind of think of it as, because not many people know about it. And it's a very unique Army Corps of Engineers authority where you can cost share projects 75% federal, 25% non-federal for a wide array of water resource projects. So drinking water, stormwater, wastewater, water resource protection. So I don't think a lot of people realize that you can get grant funding through the Corps for sewer projects or drinking water projects. So it's a really unique authority. And even if we can't figure out a way to use it for this project, I think it's something that would be of great interest to the village because, especially the stormwater component. So these projects, on average, and this is the average that we calculated over the last few years of appropriations, the average appropriation for this account was $4.2 million, which is very much in line with what the reality of these projects. So they're usually not huge projects. Again, they're not usually $30 to $33 million projects, but they can be bigger projects. You just have to separate them out into what we call separable elements. So a project that might be a $5 million total project cost or $7 million total project cost. And we've worked with other communities on environmental infrastructure projects where we've had a larger, let's say $30 million project, but we separated it out into components so we could pursue this kind of grant funding. So the largest award under this account in FY23 was 11.25 million, which is quite a bit. Like I said, we've worked on a lot of these projects before. That's pretty extreme at the high end, I'd say. $4.2 million is pretty average. But even though, again, this project is technically eligible, just because of the total project cost of the project, it might not be the best fit, but we could work with you to try to figure out if there's elements of the project we could pull out that could fit under this authority. But again, keep this in mind because there's so many different types of projects that could be funded under this. And there's currently about $13 million available under this account, but it has to support the whole state of North Carolina. So Roger mentioned earlier that there's a Water Resources Development Act bill in the works right now. And we've worked with some communities to request a significant increase to that program. So it'd be, what we requested was $50 million. So that might be too much, but fingers crossed that we'll get it. And so then there would be, should that actually be approved, $50 million to support the state of North Carolina. And because not many people know about it, your chances of securing some funding under there may be a bit higher than if you were elsewhere. So, so it's a good option, but not the top. The STAG is pretty much the top option for the appropriations this year. And then the second category of funding that we have listed here are competitive grants and loans. Again, you all are familiar with this kind of category of funding because I know the village has pursued funding for this project competitively. The first one listed here, the state Clean Water SRF, bipartisan infrastructure law funding. We know that the village has pursued funding under that particular program. And there was some difficulty in the scoring of the project, and which is something that we've dealt with for a lot of different projects. It can be very difficult to increase the score under a Clean Water SRF program, but we've done it before. We've done everything we can for some projects, and some projects are just more difficult to improve scores. But we do know that the village secured funding through that program for an asset inventory. And in part that will help improve the score. And we know that you're aware of that. But there may be other things that we can do to help you improve the scoring for that application for the financing. And then kind of what works really well with the Clean Water SRF funding is WIFIA. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with WIFIA, but it's a federal financing program. It's long-term, low-interest loans that work extremely well with the SRF funds. So they use, pretty much the same authorities. So any project that would be eligible under the Clean Water SRF or the Drinking Water SRF would be eligible under WIFIA. And you can request financing up to 49% of project costs. So you can, for example, say you secure or request 49% of financing under WIFIA, you could secure financing for the remainder under the SRF, and then add in grant funding when you can, and to lower the total amount of financing that you would need. But WIFIA is also a really great option for long-term low interest financing for the project. And we'd be happy to talk more with you and of course your staff about that option. And then the last opportunity we have listed here, it's kind of listed last for a reason, but we wanted to bring it up anyway, is the EDA Public Works Program, which you may also be familiar with. The EDA Public Works will provide grant funding for public works projects, including wastewater projects. But the amount of grant funding that you can get is relatively small. Let's just say like $3 to $4 million on average, or less. So it wouldn't cover the full cost of a project like this, but the kind of hook that you have with EPA or EDA is that you need to show certain levels of economic benefits that are coming from the project. And I mean, I think all projects like this have some kind of economic benefit, obviously. But we could work with you to kind of develop that a little bit more. And you also have a great resource, and you're part of North Carolina, the Southeastern Economic Development Commission, that helps entities like you. You've probably worked with them on EDA applications, and they're really great with, and Mike McIntyre, he knows a lot about this commission and worked with them before. They'll help you kind of see if the project works with the economic development benefits, and we'll work with you to try to make that happen. But it could be difficult with a project like this, but again, it's just something we wanted to bring up because it is one of those programs that we go to and evaluate because it's, again, one of the very few federal grant programs where you can get grant funding for a project, not just financing.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. That's excellent. You can see all the detail that you have to go in on these kinds of funding, but Stephanie's done that research and has worked with so many projects for many communities successfully. And the Ferguson Group has nationwide as well as here in North Carolina. We've got just a few moments left. Christopher Kearney was going to mention something about the current status of the wind program offshore. Chris, can you go ahead and speak to that?
Sure, I'll do that briefly. Good morning, everyone. You see the slide before you kind of sets up this proposed rulemaking that's out there. Really what this is this administration, when they came in, really was committed more than any I've seen over 30 years in Washington and 20 years of working in the Department of Interior to really promote and advance offshore wind. They felt like they had a good runway of about a dozen years or so of active work, about 11 or 12 auctions that they had engaged in. And so this rulemaking really is a blueprint for taking a lessons learned approach, if you will, to all the work that's come before. And also with the a real keen eye towards how do we make this a minimally bureaucratic process? How do we make it the most attractive to developers and to utilities to really get these programs off the ground? And so you can see there that this was initially launched in 2023. And so they are now in the middle of that process, but closing in on producing a final rule. Next slide, please. So you can see that what they set out to do, and I think they believe in the proposed rule, that they've really identified a set of major areas. All but one of these focuses on making it easier for developers, giving more flexibility on matters related to requirements under the different plans, recognizing there's a bit of timing. You're not always going to have certain data available to you when it comes to certain aspects of project development. They tried to expand certain elements of flexibility of verification processes for for DOI as they go through their process. The one that really kind of is out facing to the public is that number 4, and this really is an effort to mimic what they do and have done for decades on offshore oil and gas, which is they obviously have a broad area of where there's areas subject for lease, and that's up for bid first. And then subsequent to that, you'll have a leasing schedule that's anticipated in the 5-year window and the 5-year plan that gives folks maximum ability to comment and have input and to be aware of what's coming down the pike to the degree to which they can. That information can only go up to 2 years before it needs revision, even within the 5-year plan. And so as we look to the final rule, we will certainly be watching for it becoming public, making sure that we're clear on just exactly what it lays out, and the degree to which it expands and incorporates what it set out to in the original rule, because sometimes, as you can imagine, things change. We'll make sure to be aware of things like how much of it does it cover the folks that are currently developing the project in your area, and generally keep an eye on kind of the agency process. And then finally, with respect to the Hill and outside groups, there's a lot of folks concerned about some of the things that you all have talked about in terms of viewshed and the physical connection of the electricity from shore to the projects. And there's a lot of attention on the Hill. And so there are strong advocates for making the offshore wind effort easier and quicker and most effective in supporting the administration through appropriations and legislation. There are other folks that, certainly think that it's not necessarily bad in of itself, but worry about the dynamic of how it competes or particularly has a negative effect on fossil fuel projects and offshore projects there. So certainly we'll continue to keep an eye on that dynamic. Election years can sometimes be funny things. They're not always times where nothing happens. Sometimes strange things can happen when you're not watching. So we'll be keenly watching both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue on this issue going forward.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you. I think we've gotten in our 45 minutes. Chris McCall, and I wanted to also mention that if there are comments, we certainly welcome Drew Moritz and Bill Carey's comments about the Wilmington Harbor project. We wanted to make sure that we honored the time you gave us through the 45 minutes, but we certainly welcome Brooks Pierce to make any comments if they would like to. And I think we have otherwise concluded the formal part of our presentation, except I do want to remind you, we're looking forward to Actually, it's the week of Palm Sunday. That makes it easy to remember. It's the week of before Easter, and that's the week of the American Shore and Beach Preservation Association meeting in Washington. And as you know, we're looking forward to being up on the Hill on that Monday, March 25th, and Tuesday, March 26th. If necessary, there may be a little bit of spillover to the morning of the 27th, but hopefully we can get it done on the first 2 days I mentioned. And we are in the process of planning those meetings now. We've already been in touch with both senators' offices and with the Congressman Rouser's office. So look forward to get more details on that, and we'll be talking with you in more detail about what will be upcoming on that trip. With that, that concludes our presentation, Chris McCall. I don't know if our friends from Brooks Pierce would like to add anything before we adjourn this session, or I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and everybody that you brought with you today. And we have a few minutes. You know, I want to emphasize as we continue to work on these items that at any future council meeting, perhaps we can ask Mike and Roger and Brad to join us, where we can talk a little more in detail. I know we've compressed a lot within the time here with the retreat, but Bill or Drew, did you have any comments for the group?
You're
Chris,
muted
can you
if
hear
you
me?
do. There we go.
Hey, Chris, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So this is Bill Carey, just a very high level. The port did the 203 study. The Assistant Secretary of the Army reviewed it, had a bunch of criticisms. Congress approved the study subject to those criticisms and sent it back to the Corps. Those criticisms include completing the NEPA process, which the Corps is scheduled to start in November of this year. November 25th, they're going to issue the notice of intent. The reason they're putting that off is NEPA got changed last year, and once they issue that notice, they have 1 year to complete it, and this is a big project. So what they're trying to do is a lot of the preliminary work before the formal NEPA process starts. What they're also doing is a number of the studies that the Assistant Secretary of the Army wanted done, including a hydrologic study, a sea level rise study, and some other technical studies. And I believe they're revisiting the economic justification of this project. So in all, the Corps is budgeting $4 million for its share. State has come up with $4 million for its share. That they think will take it through the NEPA process. But if they need more money, they have indicated they're more than willing to ask for it. And in fact, they initially asked for more than an $8 million budget for this project, which is good. It means they're going to do a healthy analysis. Unfortunately, a lot of the analysis that they're currently doing, they're doing sort of in a closed box. It's not public participation like the NEPA process is. So it's been a little hard to get information on what is actually happening. We do understand that the Corps intends to develop, as part of the NEPA process, another alternative. The port, as you know, sort of came up with an all or nothing approach, and the Corps has indicated that's not going to be acceptable. There needs to be at least one other alternative, which they will include in their analysis. And that's about all I've got to say. Drew, I don't know if you need to add anything, and I'm going to put myself back on mute.
Thanks,
Certainly
Bill.
not. Yeah. As it relates to the state government side of things, April 24th is the date that the legislature will return for the short session. As you may recall, the legislature in 23 passed a 2-year biennial budget. Although there will be some funds unallocated heading into the new year, it's an election year, and depending upon how the revenue collections hold, there may be opportunities at the state level. Reminder, the legislature in recent years has done a significant job of allocating funds for infrastructure through their state capital infrastructure fund. So there's a lot of availability, certainly more so in a long session year, which will be 25, but we do anticipate there being some reversions and some availability going into the short session.
All right, thanks, Drew. And just to further add, as part of the retreat, we'll end it with a discussion on priorities and goals, and a big part of that obviously is going to be talking about legislative lobbying type priorities that we'll definitely be following up with you all in terms of those and grants and earmark requests at the federal level. So, Mayor. All
Yeah,
right, well, thank
that
you all
sounds good.
for joining us. And
Yes,
have a-
sir. Glad to be with you. Glad to be with all of you, and glad you're having such a productive time.
Yes, sir.